He's the one who handed over his friend. He's the one who brought about the crucifixion. And he's the one who is damned for all time.
He's one of the most hated men in history. The apostle who betrayed Jesus Christ. For centuries, his name has meant treachery and deceit. Judas Iscariot. Now, hidden for nearly 2,000 years, an ancient gospel emerges from the sands of Egypt. It tells a different story, one that could challenge our deepest beliefs.
It could be explosive for a lot of people. It could create a kind of crisis of, well, let's say a crisis of faith.
This account turns the story of Christ's betrayal on its head. Here, the betrayer becomes a hero, and Jesus Christ arranges his own execution. Now, a team of experts sets out to determine what it says and whether it's real or fake.
An impossible thing, unbelievable. How could someone write a gospel according to Judas?
Discovered by chance, sold twice, and stolen once. The race is on to preserve its pages before they turn to dust. Is the document an ancient heresy that should be left in the grave? Or a true account that will change the way we think of Jesus Christ? Now we read it for the first time. It is the Gospel of Judas. Many stories exist about the discovery of the Gospel of Judas, but the most likely goes like this. Egypt, 1978. Near the banks of the Nile River, a farmer, supposedly on a quest for treasure, warily makes his way into a cavern. In ancient times, its chambers have been used to bury the dead. According to this account, the farmer seeks gold or jewelry, anything of value. Instead, among the bones, he discovers a stone box. Inside, an unexpected find. A mysterious leather-bound book called a codex. The farmer can't decipher its ancient text, but he knows old books fetch a good price in Cairo's antiquities market. He has no idea he holds one of the greatest prizes of biblical archaeology, a document condemned as heresy some 1,800 years ago. "22 years later, New York, 2000. Antiquities dealer Frida Nussberger Chacos is headed to JFK Airport when she hears some stunning news. She'd recently bought the same ancient codex from an Egyptian dealer. Then she'd taken it to Yale University to have it checked out. Now, an expert drops a bombshell.
Hello? He had an extremely emotional voice, and he said, Frida, it's fantastic. This is very important documents, and I think it is the Gospel of Judas.
For Chakos, it is the payoff for years of pursuit. She had become obsessed with the mysterious codex without ever knowing what it contained.
It's more than a mission now that I think of. I think I was chosen by Judas to rehabilitate him. I think the circumstances of this manuscript coming to me were predestinated. Judas was asking me to do something for him.
Switzerland, 2002. World-renowned document restorer Florence Dabre opens the box containing the Gospel of Judas for the very first time.
I had to look at it. I had to open the box. I said, wow, and had to open and close the box several times. You need nerves of steel to touch certain objects.
In 30 years of work, she had never seen an ancient document in such bad shape. Its fragile papyrus pages have broken into hundreds of fragments.
Whatever document you work with, there is always a story. It is so ancient that you always wonder who wrote it. Where did it go? Who had it? And who read it?
To get answers, Dabre will join with Rodolphe Casser, one of the world's preeminent translators of an ancient Egyptian language called Coptic, the language the document is written in. They will spend years piecing together the fragments. Fragments that tell a story early church fathers denounced as heresy. But even in this condition, one line stands out. It is the title, Evangelium Judas, the Gospel of Judas.
An impossible thing, unbelievable. How could someone write a gospel according to Judas?
Could there really be a Gospel of Judas? What if the greatest story ever told were told through the eyes of one of history's greatest villains?
Mă scuzați, m-ați putea ajuta, vă rog?
Și un telefon ceva avem?
Noroc cu Joe!
Și tu poți fi răzvățatul grupului. Uită-te sub capacele sticlelor de bere Ursus și poți câștiga unul dintre cele 40.000 de seturi de pahare de colecție Ursus semnate de 6 personalități, adevărate povești de succes românești.
Masează-ți pielea chiar în timp ce faci duș. Noul Nivea Firming Gel de duș cu dispozitiv reglabil pentru masaj. Pentru o piele vizibil mai fermă. Atât de fermă încât n-ai motive să o ascunzi. Noul gel de duș Firming de la Nivea.
tehnologia unică Fresh System, boabele proaspăt prăjite sunt înghețate înainte de măcinare, pentru ca gustul și aroma să se regăsească intacte în fiecare ceașcă pe care o savurezi. Selected cu Fresh System, formula prospețimii.
În fiecare zi, de 30 de ani, la Salonta facem mezeluri. Zi de zi alegem carnea, afumăm mezelurile cu fum din lemn fără rășini, le supraveghem 75 de zile viteza de uscare și temperatura, le însemânțăm cu mucegai nobil și apoi le curățăm. Zi de zi. Salonta. 30 de ani de experiență în mezeluri.
25 de ani de Quattro. Pentru mai multă performanță. Pentru mai multă libertate. Pentru mai mult control. Acum am inventat o mașină pentru Quattro. Audi Q7 de la creatorul lui Quattro.
Evoluția, cea mai grozavă poveste istorisită vreodată. Sânge, furie, cooperare, conflicte. O singură lege a domnit întotdeauna, legea supraviețuirii. Este povestea ce ne poate schimba percepția asupra lumii noastre. Triumful vieții, sâmbătă seară la 7. Un asteroid gigant lovind Pământul. Sfârșitul rasei umane. Amenințarea unei mega-erupții. Ți-ai spus că e doar imaginație de Hollywood. Mai gândește-te. Cercetătorii studiază planeta, misterele ce o înconjoară și amenințările ce o pândesc. Nu e ficțiune, sunt dovezi. Planeta la control. În curând pe National Geographic.
Who was Judas Iscariot? The Bible tells us he is the apostle who betrayed Jesus Christ. Without him, the crucifixion might never have happened. But for someone so notorious, we know few facts about him. He was one of the 12 apostles. He may have come from Judea, not Galilee like Christ and the others. But if the details of his life are murky, there's no question about his place in history. In Dante's Inferno, Judas is condemned to the lowest pits of hell, where he is eaten head first by Lucifer himself. As reputations go, that's a hard one to shake.
Generally today, people think of Judas principally as the betrayer of Jesus, somebody who was a traitor to the cause. Often they think of him as somebody who was greedy, avaricious, who was more interested in making money than being faithful to his master.
The word itself is despised, I think, virtually throughout the Western world. You wouldn't even call your dog that. And Germany, of course, it is illegal to name your child Judas.
Judas may have been the apostles' treasurer, and some experts claim he was Jesus' most trusted ally, making his betrayal all the more contemptible.
He's the one who handed over his friend. He's the one who brought about the crucifixion. And he's the one who is damned for all time for that reason.
Christ and all his apostles were observant Jews. But in time, Judas's dark deeds became an excuse for hating all Jews.
Traditionally in Christian circles, Judas, in fact, has been associated with Jews, not just because of his name, but also because of these characteristics that became stereotypes for Jews in the Middle Ages, of being traitors, avaricious, who in fact betray Jesus, who are Christ killers. And this portrayal of Judas, of course, also leads then to horrendous acts of anti-Semitism through the centuries.
Judas's evil reputation is based on just 18 passages in the Gospels.
Well, Judas Iscariot, the New Testament, doesn't appear much, and I think it's because he's an embarrassment. And what little is said about him is very sinister, so he's portrayed in increasingly villainous terms as a thief who steals from the money box, indeed, even as a person who was influenced by Satan.
But what if there were another story about Judas Iscariot? One that turns this traditional portrait on its head. History records that there was. Around 180 AD, Bishop Irenaeus, one of the early church's most influential leaders, wrote a scathing attack against one book in circulation. Its title, The Gospel of Judas.
This gospel was about the relationship of Jesus and Judas and indicated that Judas didn't actually betray Jesus, but did what Jesus wanted him to do, because Judas was the one who really knew the truth as Jesus wanted it communicated.
But this version of Judas's story was condemned by Irenaeus and other early church leaders. By branding it heresy, they effectively erased it from history, never to be seen again. Or did they? At the lab in Switzerland, restorer Darbre and translator Casser are trying to figure out if this is a lost copy of the Gospel of Judas. But first, they must piece together one of the most complex puzzles ever contrived by history. The Gospel is written on 13 pieces of papyrus, both front and back. If a fragment fits on one side, it must also fit on the other.
If you take a 9 to 10 page typed document and rip it up into tiny pieces, throw away half the pieces, and try to reconstruct the other half, you will see how difficult this process is.
To avoid touching the actual document until they have to, they've devised an ingenious plan. First, using photographs of both the fragments and the pages, Casser looks for a match. Then, working with photocopies, he cuts and pastes.
Every time we're able to place a fragment, I bring a photocopy of it to Madame Darbre, who uses it to place the fragment within the original.
Then Madame Darbre tests whether Casser was right.
It is now my job to verify if this fragment can actually be placed there by analyzing the quality of the papyrus, its color, its fibers, and to see if there are any similarities.
We understand the meaning of the codex little by little, thanks to these victories.
Definitely. The more fragments are added, the more we can read, and the more the story is revealed.
There are hundreds of fragments left to place, but what they've revealed is already dramatic. This text matches the document Irenaeus railed against some 1800 years ago. The proof is in one of its most chilling lines, where Jesus gives Judas his mission of betrayal.
Atiwe raf mikolhom. Yehuda atit bach hadain bagra da anash da makasel.
A preliminary investigation of the Gospel of Judas reveals 3 facts. First, scholars confirm that the papyrus the Gospel is written on looks identical to other ancient documents. Second, the title, written in Coptic, reads Gospel of Judas. And third, what they've seen so far matches the text Bishop Irenaeus denounced in 180 AD. These early conclusions must now be backed up by science. To prove it's an authentic ancient text, the owner of the Gospel, the Maecenas Foundation, with support from the National Geographic Society, assembles a dream team of biblical detectives to join with Professor Kasser. Dr. Stephen Emmel is a leading expert in ancient papyrus and paleography, or ancient handwriting. Dr. Marvin Meyer is a Coptic expert, and along with Kasser, he'll write the final translation. And Dr. Timothy Joe is a radiocarbon dating specialist. Each expert will use his specialty to complete part of the puzzle and answer the question, is it real? High-profile fakes have tarnished many careers. Take the notorious Hitler diaries, or the ossuary of James, a burial box said to belong to the brother of Jesus, but now widely believed to be a fake. Reputations are on the line.
The handwriting.
Papyrus expert Stephen Emmel is the first to weigh in. He has already spent hours examining the document and believes there's no chance it's a modern forgery.
No, I've looked at hundreds of papyri, Coptic papyri, in my career, and this is absolutely typical of ancient Coptic manuscripts. No, I'm completely convinced. The number of people who could create such a text is very small. How many would you say? Perhaps 25?
Oh, not so much.
Not so many, you know?
I would say 4 or 5.
4 or 5. We're 2 of them. Now, who would create such a thing? Someone would have to know Coptic better than we do, right? And there isn't anybody that knows Coptic better than we do, I'm sorry.
But the document's still a total mystery. They don't even know how it got to Egypt, where it was supposedly found, or when it was written. To find out, Coptic expert Dr. Marvin Meyer heads to Egypt.
Well, if we can know something about the date and the circumstances of the composition or the translation of a text, that will help us a great deal to determine that this, in fact, is an authentic text from the ancient world.
Meyer thinks the Gospel was originally written in Greek in the Middle East and later brought to a Christian community in Egypt. Once here, he thinks it was translated into Coptic, a language that descended directly from the ancient Egyptian of the pharaohs.
At the time that the Gospel of Judas was translated in Egypt, this area was a wonderful and wild kind of place. It was a marketplace of ideas with different kinds of people, with different kinds of approaches. Emerging Orthodox Christians and Gnostics and monks and all kinds of folks were here together, sharing their ideas, agreeing and disagreeing, and producing their books.
One of those books was the Codex containing the Gospel of Judas. Finding the cave where it was discovered would help confirm its authenticity. So Meyer heads south, along the Nile, to the area where the Codex was reportedly found. But finding the exact cave is a long shot. It would help if Meyer could talk to the man who bought the Codex from the farmer who found it. Investigators tried to find him, but that man didn't want to be found. A search for him results in dead ends and slammed doors. That's because in Egypt, it's dangerous to talk about the black market antiquities trade. People who do could be arrested by the police or attacked by criminal gangs involved in looting. Without the eyewitness, Meyer has to rely on the most likely story of how the Codex was found. According to that account, it was found somewhere near a village called Jabel Karara. but the region is huge. To help him narrow the search, he rendezvous with archaeologists from the Egyptian Antiquities Ministry. The officials guide Meyer into the desert, toward a group of caves they've only heard about. After 2 hours in the sun, they reach an immense plateau, pitted with caves.
What is this here? It looks as if there's some kind of...
Here, it looks like someone hit pay dirt.
Intrusion. What is this hold on?
Looters. Graves seem to have been dug up, bones scattered. But that's not all. Everywhere, ancient Coptic artifacts that tell Meyer this might be the place.
There was Coptic pottery all over the place, some Coptic fabric that was found here. There was brick that had been used for some structure and flooring. It all suggested that this had been a place of some significance, probably during Coptic times.
Oh, that's right. Oh, that's a very nice piece. And that would have been...
Pottery fragments found here date as late as the 10th century AD, but as early as the 3rd century. Experts think the codex containing the Gospel was created in the 3rd or 4th century. Is this the cave where the farmer found the codex?
Without the report of an eyewitness, we can't be sure about the exact place where the Gospel of Judas was found. But the story is that it was found in a cave in this area, and that it was found in a cave that had Coptic characteristics, like this cave. So whether it was exactly this cave or a cave like it, certainly the Gospel of Judas must have been found in a cave very much like this one.
But Meyer needs more evidence to know if the Gospel's authentic. One more lead takes him to Cairo's Coptic Museum. When he read fragments from the Gospel of Judas, they reminded Meyer of another dramatic discovery in biblical archaeology, texts now known as the Nag Hammadi Library. In 1945, in southern Egypt, a shepherd stumbled across this collection of more than 30 ancient documents. Some 3 decades ago, Meyer worked on their translation. He thinks the Gospel of Judas bears an uncanny resemblance to the Nag Hammadi texts. And in the words of these documents, he finds the proof he's looking for.
There are striking similarities between the Gospel of Judas and a number of the texts in the Nag Hammadi Library. Those similarities extend to some of the names that are used in these texts, the basic worldview that is encapsulated in these texts. Look at how different.
Meyer thinks the same religious movement wrote the Gospel of Judas and the Nag Hammadi texts. It all seems to add up. The Nag Hammadi Library has been dated to the 3rd and 4th centuries. The same period experts think the Gospel of Judas was copied. What's more, the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered in about the same region where Meyer found the looted cave. For Meyer, the words, timing, and location confirm the Gospel of Judas is an authentic ancient text. As for the codex containing the Gospel, removal from its burial place was just the beginning of a bizarre cloak and dagger journey.
De unde vine senzația unică pe care ți-o dă Milka Lufle? E simplu. Sunt mii de bule de ciocolată.
Să-i dăm drumul! Hai, rata e servită! Nu avem destule bule! Ursule, treci la aparat!
E Milka Lufle cu mii și mii de bule de ciocolată.
E atât de fină, oare cum se face?
Nu știu, dar cred că au o tehnologie foarte avansată.
Milka Lufle, cea mai fină ciocolată aerată.
Cadabra! Batoanele Nestlé Nesquik combină laptele și cerealele preferate ale copilului tău, oferind toată bunătatea calciului, vitaminelor și cerealelor integrale. Indiferent unde sunt copiii tăi, ești sigură că mănâncă batoane de cereale hrănitoare. Batoanele Nestlé Nesquik și Chocapic, toată bunătatea din cereale și lapte.
Hello, Moto.
Zuzu, noile iaurturi.
Totul era perfect în rai, însă de când am descoperit crema de brânză Philadelphia, cu gustul său delicios de brânză adevărată și consistența fină, cremoasă, mă simt cu adevărat în al nouălea cer. Philadelphia, gustul divin.
Se potrivește perfect cu culori intense a părului tău. Și a ta e frumoasă, Kitty. Da, dar părul e aspru și degradat. Nu le poți avea pe toate. Sigur că poți. Cu Garnier Color Naturals. Uite, intensă, nu? Wow, și ce mătăsos e! Datorită uleiului de măsline. Garnier Color Naturals. Culori intensă, fără păr degradat.
Garnier! Cel mai tânăr, dar viguros vinars de murfatlar rămâne 22 de lei noi până când vrem noi.
I gave a letter to the postman, put it in this sack. Bright and early next morning, he brought my letter back. Return to sender, address unknown.
Iacob Scrânung, puterea alintaromei.
Consumul excesiv de alcool dăunează grav sănătății. Un secret teribil, prea secret pentru a fi rostit, apărat de societăți nevăzute, ascuns într-o operă de artă și transmis peste generații spre știința înțelepților de azi. O carte la modă. Aflați adevărul. Codul lui Da Vinci descifrat. Vineri noapte la 10.
E de 4 ori mai probabil să fim loviți de un asteroid decât de un trăsnet. Nu e ficțiune, e știință. Planeta la control. În curând pe National Geographic Channel.
Cairo, 1980. The farmer who found the codex containing the Gospel of Judas has sold it on the Egyptian antiquities market. It's difficult to confirm precisely what happened next, but a likely version goes like this. The document's new owner, an Egyptian dealer, shows his collection of ancient art objects to a potential buyer.
أنا آسف يا مدام الأسعار الأيام دي ولعة قوي قوي قوي.
دي جميلة.
ده أنت بتهتمي بالحاجات دي؟
أيوة طبعا.
ده أنا عندي حاجات أجمل وأجمل. هجيبها لك دلوقتي.
The buyer seems to want it all. The Egyptian's entire collection, worth millions.
لا ده مفيش حاجة، باخد شوية صور. خليك كده حلو قوي كده.
كده؟
جميل. تانية كمان؟ حلوة قوي. طب في واحدة تانية كمان.
مين يهتم بالحاجات دي؟
ده واحد خواجة.
The woman claims to represent a buyer with deep pockets. But she's lying. She's actually casing the apartment and the collection and planning a heist. Later that night, armed with a complete inventory of the Egyptians' treasures, she heads back to pick up a few things. She breaks in and cleans out the best of the lot. On her list, the ancient codex. Amazingly, as it vanishes into the antiquities underworld, no one knows it's priceless. That inside it is a lost gospel and a version of Christ's betrayal that no one has heard for almost 1,800 years. Why would early Christians write a Gospel of Judas in the first place? Jerusalem, about 100 AD. In the century after Christ's death, the Roman-ruled city is a place of intense religious ferment. Judaism, Roman cults, and Christian groups all compete for followers. But one religion is about to break from the pack: Christianity. This period of early Christianity wasn't what most people think. There was no Christian Bible. Instead, different versions of Christ's story were passed from one Christian to another. Eventually, the stories were written in the Gospels, but not until 30 to 60 years after Christ's death. And today, most scholars believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John died long before their Gospels were written.
One of the interesting phenomena from early Christianity is that the four Gospels that made it into the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all anonymous. The titles were added by later editors. They weren't there, written there by the authors themselves.
And there's another surprising twist to the story of the faith in the early centuries. There weren't just 4 Gospels. There were more than 30.
A gospel means the good news. So the question is, who is Jesus and what is the good news about him? Very many people saw that question in different ways.
In the first 200 years after Christ's death, literally dozens of different and sometimes conflicting versions of his life and message circulated. One of them was the Gospel of Judas.
This text, like many other texts recently discovered at Nag Hammadi, gives us a look into kinds of Christianity we'd never seen before. Many people had thought that the only Gospels there were the Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But actually, there were many more than that. There might have been dozens, like the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, just to mention a few. There wasn't one early Christianity, there were many.
One faith or many, Christianity grew explosively, from Jerusalem to Asia Minor and Egypt, Rome and North Africa. There were no churches yet. Instead, followers met in private homes, where some heard Gospels named for people that would surprise most churchgoers today.
Some used Philip, some used Thomas, some used the Gospel of Mary. Others used Matthew or Mark or Luke or John.
Some of the early Christians are now called Gnostics, or the people who know.
The Gnostics were mystics. That is to say, they were people that felt they could have some kind of direct access to God. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. But this kind of knowledge is not everyday knowledge. It is not book learning. It is insight. It is intuition. It is that ability to know something about yourself, to know that you have a spark of the divine inside of you, and to recognize the God that you profess to be, the God that is outside, is the same as that spark of the divine that is within you. And many of the Gnostics were Christians.
Gnostics are the people who wrote most of the texts known as the Nag Hammadi Library. Their stories about Christ are much more abstract and philosophical than those of the New Testament. One favorite was the Gospel of Thomas.
Kihi Vasilia tu, Theo entos, human esticactos, hos an hefton noin, taften hevrisi, kihot humis, heaftus, nain susite, ethicite hote, hu este humis, tu patros, tu santos.
When some of us were in graduate school and we first got to know these other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, we were told, well, these are Gnostic, these are heretical, these are weird and strange. We were told that Gnostics means, people who were basically wrong. And this is sort of like in the 1940s and 50s in this country, you'd talk about the communists. And that's a way of dismissing them. So Gnostic is a term like that. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Christians.
Early church fathers fought against the Gnostics.
One of the difficulties that the Gnostics presented for people in the emerging Orthodox Church was the fact that Gnostics didn't need to have the advice and the control and the insight that came from the priests and the bishops. They had that insight in themselves, and that bothered the church leaders.
That's not all that irritated church leaders. The Gnostics also preached that the body was a prison for the divine spirit within. To them, Jesus' death was a good thing, and Judas a hero for helping to free Christ's spirit. In fact, that's one reason experts think the Gospel of Judas was written by Gnostics.
The Gospel of Judas turns Judas's act of betrayal into an act of obedience. The sacrifice of Jesus' body of flesh, in fact, becomes saving. And so for that reason, Judas emerges as the champion, and he ends up being envied and even cursed and resented by the other disciples.
But ideas like this were just too shocking for early church leaders. They rejected the Gospel of Judas along with about 30 Gnostic texts and kept them out of the New Testament. How did church leaders decide what to keep in and what to throw out? Somehow the Gospel of Judas ended up on the cutting room floor. The process took hundreds of years, but it got a critical jump start in 180 AD, and it was born in blood. Switzerland, 1983. Remarkably, after it was stolen from him, the Egyptian dealer recovered the codex containing the Gospel of Judas. In 1983, he resurfaced with it in Geneva. Now he's invited 3 scholars, each from an American university, to bid on the codex and other ancient documents. One of them is Stephen Emmel, the same expert who decades later would help authenticate the Gospel's handwriting.
In May of 1983, I was asked if I would travel to Geneva to look at a Coptic manuscript that an American university library was interested in buying. The collection of papyri that was being offered for sale consisted of 3 different manuscripts, 2 in Greek, 1 in Coptic. I don't think the Egyptian man had any idea what he had, except that it was ancient papyrus books. And that's the kind of thing that one sees in museums, and so it's valuable. We were told we were not allowed to make any photographs, we were not allowed to make any notes. My impression was that the Egyptian man expected us simply to open the boxes, to see that, yes, indeed, there are papyri here, close them back up, and hand over whatever money he wanted and take them away with us. I assumed that these manuscripts had been brought out of Egypt illegally. I had no concrete knowledge of that. So that, in a way, this was a clandestine, an illegal meeting.
Emil immediately sees that it's an invaluable codex.
What I saw was the top part of a papyrus codex, very much like one of the Nag Hammadi codices, in relatively good condition, I would say. It was written in a very nice literary Coptic script, easily readable. I leafed through and by chance spotted a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. And in particular, the name Judas came up again and again. Judas said, XXX, the Lord said, blah, blah, blah.
Because he can only make a hasty examination, Emil doesn't know he's looking at the Gospel of Judas. The negotiations don't get far. Together, the scholars have only $100,000 to spend.
And the asking price turned out to be $3 million, so a tremendously larger sum than we possibly could scrape together. I think the Egyptian was terribly disappointed. I think he thought we were lying when we said we didn't have that kind of money.
But to show there are no hard feelings, the Egyptian takes the scholars to lunch.
I excused myself to the bathroom at some point and took that opportunity to pull out paper and pencil and simply write down from memory everything that I had consciously tried to memorize concerning the characteristics of the two Coptic manuscripts.
Wait a minute.
In Emil's report, he gives a dire warning about the Codex's future.
There is great danger of further deterioration of the manuscript as long as it is in the hands of the present owner. This unique item must be put as quickly as possible into the hands of a library or museum where it can be restored, published, and conserved.
That didn't happen. For the Codex, the Egyptian's inability to sell it is a nearly fatal blow. He next takes the Codex to the United States, where he attempts and fails to sell it to a collector in New York City. Thwarted, he stores the ancient book in a bank vault. Unbelievably, the Codex will sit for nearly 16 years in a safe deposit box in Hicksville, New York, drying out, crumbling, turning to dust.
Despre ofertele cu adevărat speciale vorbește toată lumea. Toyota Corolla îți oferă acum un avantaj client de până la 1200 de euro cu toate taxele incluse. Ai auzit bine, avantaj client de până la 1200 de euro de la Toyota Corolla. Te așteptăm la un test drive.
Cauți o soluție cu efect imediat împotriva mătreții? Tigel Total de la Neutrogena este eficient împotriva mătreții chiar de la prima utilizare, prin combinarea doi ingredienți antimătreață, ihtiol și elubiol, pentru eficiență de durată încă de la prima utilizare. Tigel Total de la Neutrogena.
Cel mai tânăr, dar viguros vinars de murfatlar rămâne 22 de lei noi până când vrem noi.
Mătreața revine mereu? Acum? Spune adio! Garnier Fructis, primul șampon antimătreață cu efect antirecidivă cu concentrat activ de fructe. Acționează chiar de la prima aplicare. Eficacitatea lui durează 4 săptămâni de la oprirea tratamentului. Spune adio mătreții! Garnier Fructis antimătreață cu efect antirecidivă.
Garnier!
Nou de la Garnier! Fructis antimătreață special pentru păr gras.
Vedeți câtă lume vorbește deja cu Eufonica? Sunt vizibil mulțumiți.
Alo!
Eufonica oferă o economie de până la 20% la convorbiri interjudețene și până la 40% la cele internaționale. Aveți abonament la telefon fix? Sunați gratuit la 0800 81688 și înregistrați-vă acum. Primiți contractul prin poștă, semnați-l și trimiteți-l înapoi. Cadoul nostru, 25 de minute interjudețene gratuite. Formați 1688 înainte de numărul apelat și vorbiți, vorbiți, vorbiți. E simplu, ieftin și ușor de utilizat. Eufonica. Telefonați mai ieftin.
I gave a letter to the postman, put it in this sack. Bright and early next morning, he brought my letter back. Return to sender, address unknown.
Iacob Scrânung, puterea alintaromei. Consumul excesiv de alcool dăunează grav sănătății.
Matei, Marcu, Luca, Ioan și Iuda. 4 evanghelii în Biblie. Toate îl consideră pe Iuda trădător. Dar dacă ar mai fi existat încă o evanghelie? Dacă unul dintre cei mai huliți oameni ai istoriei a fost de fapt greșit înțeles? Dacă acesta și-ar putea spune acum cuvântul?
Un text ascuns 2000 de ani n-ar putea schimba cele mai profunde credințe. Pregătiți-vă pentru Evanghelia lui Iuda în această noapte la 10.
Fixați-vă centurile de siguranță. Traversăm o zonă de turbulență maximă.
Zborul n-ar trebui să fie atât de înfricoșător. Seria nouă, Dezastre în aer, pe National Geographic Channel. Ei sunt familia. Intri prin jurământ de sânge și ai o singură cale să ieși.
Eu n-aș avea încredere în nimeni.
Sunt mândri în secretul lor și legea tăcerii le era lege până acum.
Ai grijă, o să sări în aer.
Mafia vă prezintă Mafia.
Amândoi aveau gâtul tăiat.
Vineri la ora 23.
Christianity is an illegal religion, and the faithful are paying with their lives. Romans are murdering Christians for refusing to sacrifice animals to Roman gods.
Irenaeus is fighting to survive against the Romans, who are persecuting severely the Christian church. And there are cases where individual Christians are arrested and tortured, cases where there's actual massacres.
Among their duties, Roman governors had to keep the people entertained. Killing Christians in spectacularly brutal ways was cheaper than hiring gladiators to do battle.
In Irenaeus' hometown, there were public riots against the Christians, and many were arrested, charged with being Christian, and many confessed that they were, and they were brought into the public arena on holiday and spectacularly killed to entertain the populace.
At the Lyon massacre of 177, Romans murdered as many as 100 Christians. Some maintained their faith to the end.
Among them was a slave woman named Blandina, who, they say, was tortured unbelievably all day in the arena, and nevertheless maintained her witness to Christ in a way that astonished everyone who saw her.
One diabolical device was called the iron chair. By heaping coals under the chair, Romans made it roasting hot, then forced the victims in.
Arami Vrantina hiera piisis.
Eristianidemi. Ton uk. Asebunto.
Iar. Ari aputhenem ethelis. Paratiton peda. Prostia filis.
O de pes. Aidzosi.
The torture and killing of 100 or so Christians at Lyon would have impacted Irenaeus greatly. It would have told him that if you're going to die for the faith, you better understand what the faith is. If you're going to be thrown into a dungeon, if you're going to be tortured or thrown into an arena and torn apart by animals, you better know why that is. And so, what then are the Gospels? Is it just these 3 or 4 or 5, or is it a whole bunch? And so this has to be defined. What is the sacred faith for which we're dying?
To help define the sacred faith, Irenaeus chose 4 Gospels from more than 30. Experts don't agree about how this choice was made.
The average Christian said, I want to hear Mark or I want to hear Matthew. But not very many were saying, I want to hear Thomas or Judas. That's what was happening. Those 4 were chosen because they resonated with the Christian communities. They resonated with the believers. These are the true words of Jesus, not these other words that you find in Thomas or Judas or some of these other writings.
It's hard to say how these texts were actually chosen. I mean, some people think they were just selected by bishops, and others think it was a kind of sort of bottom-up process of what books people tended to read. It's probably some of both, because the Gospels of the New Testament are a lot easier to read than most of these secret Gospels. They tell narrative stories. They tell about Jesus' baptism and his birth and his life and his crucifixion and his death.
But Irenaeus wasn't just choosing what would make it in. He was attacking the competition. One of his targets? The authors of the Gospel of Judas.
They declare that Judas the traitor, alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. They produce a fictitious story of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas.
It seems that what bothered Irenaeus in particular about the Gospel of Judas is that here was a gospel written in the name of the person that was the infamous betrayer of Jesus. And how could Gospel and Judas be put together in a title, the Gospel of Judas? It blew his mind, boggled his mind.
It's no accident that somebody like Irenaeus would have rejected the Gospel of Judas and declared it a heretical gospel. Here, Judas in this gospel is the good guy, the one who really understood Jesus, the only disciple who understood Jesus.
Hicksville, New York, 1999. 16 years in a safe deposit box almost accomplished what early church fathers could not. utter destruction of the Gospel of Judas.
I heard about it. Rumors.
Finally, antiquities dealer Frida Chakos tracked it down. She had known about the codex since the late 1970s. She didn't know what it contained, but she had a mysterious need to find it.
I wondered what happened to it because it didn't come out. Nobody talked about it. So I thought maybe it is somewhere. Maybe I'll try to see whether it still exists. And indeed.
She contacted the Egyptian owner who agreed to show her the text in New York. 20 years after she first heard about it, Chakos was about to see the codex.
All the edges were very brittling, a lot of dusty pieces. They looked terrible. They looked in a bad state. I wanted to protect them and give them to people who could read them, conserve them, and I felt I had a mission.
Chakos bought the codex for about $300,000 and then tried to sell it. First to Yale University, then another collector. Yale didn't bite, but they did give her something priceless. They told her what she had. That's when Chakos began a relationship with Judas Iscariot.
I do feel connected with Judas. He was condemned by thousands of years, and here I have this gospel which says that he didn't want to betray Jesus. He was asked to do it against his will. I feel that I am called upon to rehabilitate him. Yes, I do feel that.
Chakos also wants to return the codex to Egypt. But first, two things have to happen. It has to be restored so it can be translated, and it has to be verified as authentic. All the experts' research in both the lab and the field indicates that the Gospel of Judas is real. But no one really knows how old it is. Only radiocarbon dating can prove it. It turns out to carbon date something, you have to destroy it, or at least part of it. To date the Gospel, they must take samples from its pages and leather binding. Radiocarbon dating expert Dr. Timothy Joe and Professor Kasser choose the places to sample, careful to avoid any letters. Now Madame Darbre does what for her is unthinkable. Taking a knife to a document she's so painstakingly restored.
When I had to cut a piece of papyrus, I have to say I wasn't too pleased, because I spend my time trying to replace the little pieces.
Five tiny samples from the Codex now travel some 6,000 miles to the University of Arizona's Physics Center. Here, Dr. Joe will do what some early church fathers maybe wished they had.
I will have to burn the Gospel of Judas in order to be able to date it.
Once the fragments are clean, the tiny pieces of the Gospel of Judas go up in flames. After burning, these graphite pellets are all that's left of the fragments. Now the pellets go into the room-sized radiocarbon dating machine. In 15 hours, the machine will spit out a date and confirm once and for all whether the Gospel of Judas is real or fake. Radiocarbon dating works like this. Every living thing on Earth absorbs a certain kind of carbon molecule called carbon-14. The gospel is made of papyrus. When the papyrus was alive, it absorbed carbon-14 molecules. When it was harvested, these molecules began decaying. And they decayed at a predictable rate, a certain amount every year. It's like a clock that ticks backwards. Scientists know how much carbon-14 is in the papyrus now. By using the clock, they can figure out the approximate date the papyrus was harvested. The results are in. The truth is in the numbers.
Radiocarbon dating of the papyrus, which is from the Gospel of Judas, confirms that it's from the 3rd to the 4th century AD, and this supports the authenticity of the Gospel of Judas.
Radiocarbon dating proves for the first time that the document dates from 280 AD, plus or minus 50 years. That means the Gospel of Judas is an authentic text from the ancient world. It's not a forgery. Now that we know it's real, we can discover what it says. In Switzerland, the epic repair job is almost done. The last of almost 1,000 fragments is put into place. A new, tantalizing passage of the gospel is now complete. It presents a unique relationship between Jesus and Judas, a portrayal that makes Judas privy to the greatest secrets of all, the secrets of heaven.
هليخ من أخراني وأودخ رزاي مال كوثا همال كورابا أوفلا صوف دا أين ملخ لخماث ويتاي خاش فاث لفلا إثبون ناف.
Is the Lost Gospel's portrait of Judas really so different from the New Testament account? In fact, Judas wasn't always portrayed as a villain. He grows more evil from the first Gospel, Mark, to the last, John.
The Gospel of Mark was written about the year 60 and is, of course, considered by most scholars to be the earliest Gospel. He has about 1/3 as many references to Judas as does, say, John. But the way the act of Judas is portrayed is most striking. Judas is not a villain in Mark's Gospel.
This is called the Upper Room, after a reference in the Gospel of Mark. According to tradition, it's where Jesus and the apostles held the Last Supper. Dr. William Clausen has spent much of his professional life trying to understand the Gospel's portrait of Judas. In Mark's account of what happened in this room, the focus is not on Judas.
The intimacy of that scene cannot be overemphasized. I mean, there's a very close encounter between Jesus and his disciples. And for Jesus to bring in the note that his end is near must have been very painful to them.
من كشتا أمرنا لكم دي خد منكم دي أكل يمين يشيل اليمين مرهنة مرهنة هنا هو خد من تري أزرق خدت سبا الخميمي بالجنة.
In Mark's Last Supper, Judas is not pointed out as the betrayer. But by Matthew, the next gospel to be written, his guilt is never in doubt.
The Gospel of Matthew seemed to be written some 10 or 12 years after Mark. Matthew seems to put some guilt on Judas's shoulders.
The betrayal takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane, just outside Jerusalem's walls. Judas identifies Jesus to the waiting soldiers with history's most famous kiss.
نايم أتون كوم نزال هودي شل من الكريم
يهودا مع أفاناس.
سلام ربي. خفرة مادي أفد أتأفد ضربت أفكار. بتلو هو يا أخي بخارف يموت.
According to Matthew's Gospel, when Judas heard that Jesus had gone from Caiaphas to Pilate, he was despondent. Judas left that place, and knowing that Jesus would surely die in the hands of Pilate, he committed suicide.
Mare surpriză. Ce-ți pățești?
Kiki? Kiki!
Am scos pe toți din testament!
Măsoară timpul cum vrei tu, pentru că la Orange îl oprești când vrei. Ai 30 de minute gratuite la fiecare 3 plătite, 1440 de minute în rețea și abonament gratuit 3 luni.
The future's bright, the future's orange.
25 de ani de 4. Pentru mai multă performanță. Pentru mai multă libertate. Pentru mai mult control. Acum am inventat o mașină pentru Quattro. Audi Q7 de la creatorul lui Quattro.
Zuzu, noile iaurturi.
The answers I've been looking for, been here all the time. Everything
24 de ore performanță maximă. Primele deodorante create să muncească non-stop pentru tine. Nivea Deo Spray, cu forța noului sistem de înaltă eficacitate.
Masează-ți pielea chiar în timp ce faci duș. Noul Nivea Firming Gel de duș cu dispozitiv reglabil pentru masaj. Pentru o piele vizibil mai fermă. Atât de fermă încât n-ai motive să o ascunzi. Noul gel de duș Firming de la Nivea.
Prin tehnologia unică Fresh System, boabele proaspăt prăjite sunt înghețate înainte de măcinare, pentru ca gustul și aroma să se regăsească intacte în fiecare ceașcă pe care o savurezi. Selected cu Fresh System, formula prospețimii.
Cel mai tânăr, dar viguros vinar zemurfatlar rămâne 22 de lei noi până când vrem noi.
Totul era perfect în rai, însă de când am descoperit crema de brânză Philadelphia, cu gustul său delicios de brânză adevărată și consistența fină, cremoasă, mă simt cu adevărat în al nouălea cer. Philadelphia, gustul divin.
Consumul excesiv de alcool dăunează grav sănătății. Pentru oameni cu mega apetit, avem un mega meniu. Porții pantagruelice din specialitățile National Geographic Channel. Mega inginerie pură, sfidând gravitația. Ce poate fi mare, va fi uriaș. Mega structuri, luni pe National Geographic. Ar putea fi cea mai importantă descoperire pe care unii ar dori-o nedescoperită. Secretele Bibliei la lumină. În curând pe National Geographic Channel.
In another New Testament account, Judas doesn't hang, but falls to his death here. It's called the Field of Blood. Today, it's a garbage dump.
What history does with people is, of course, a fascinating subject. Christians have vilified Judas and have simply consigned him to a garbage dump.
The darkest portrait of all is in the Gospel of John, the last gospel written. In its Last Supper scene, Judas is transformed from apostle to evil incarnate.
Amin Costa, amarna lekum. Dihad me.
Manu.
Uchada, diyahefna.
ليهدى لخمة من بطن سبقتي بالجنان.
Before ma, da avid at avid.
In John's Gospel, Judas is a fully developed character and a very evil one. John also says that the Jews are trying to kill Jesus, and the term Judas means Jew as well, or could mean Jew. So it's a peculiar thing to see how this figure is embroidered and amplified. It's a very curious question to ask, why does the figure of Judas become increasingly evil For what reasons are people telling the story this way?
Some experts believe Christians demonized Judas to distance themselves from Jews in a bid to help their faith survive. In the year 66 AD, Jews tried to expel Rome from Judea in a disastrous 4-year war called the Great Jewish Revolt. Jerusalem held off a Roman siege for months. When they finally broke through, Romans murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews and burned the Second Temple, the spiritual center of Jewish life. Today, almost all that remains is the Western Wall, where Jews still mourn the temple's destruction.
The destruction of the temple in the year 70 exacerbated the problems between Christian Jews and Jews who were not believers in Jesus as the Messiah. Jews had to decide what their religion actually was made up of. What does it mean to be Jewish now that we no longer have a temple and temple sacrifice? Well, one thing it certainly means is that we stand over against these people saying that Jesus is the Messiah.
The rift between Christian and Jew had another cause. Christians were inviting Gentiles, or non-Jews, into the faith.
The movement is intending to appeal to more non-Jews, more Gentiles. It's also trying to dissociate Jesus from the disastrous Jewish war against Rome and claim that not only Jesus was innocent of the charge on which he was crucified, which is treason against Rome, but that his followers are also innocent of the charge of sedition against Rome on which they're being executed every day.
The hardcore fact is that Jesus was killed by Romans on a Roman cross, and yet through history it's been the Jews who have been to blame.
Whatever was behind it, the Bible's portrait of an evil Judas became an inspiration for later anti-Semitism.
The fact is that the Gospels do become increasingly anti-Jewish as the movement becomes more and more Gentile. And that has had enormous effect on the history of Christianity and on the world, even to the 20th and the 21st century.
Unfortunately, Judas becomes the poster boy for anti-Semitic thinking. And unfortunately, Judas becomes then this negative ideal for those who are hateful and anti-Semitic and want to portray the Jewish people in the terms of Judas the betrayer. But that is inauthentic to the message of the New Testament and inauthentic to the teaching and message of Jesus.
When I was in graduate school, I believed what I was taught at the time, which is that anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic elements were not in the New Testament and were only read in by people who were evil. But when I began to study the text in detail, I saw that many people realize that they are there in the later Gospels, in the way the Passion story is told. They are part of the story of Christianity. And it's very important for people who love the Christian tradition, as I do, and people who identify with it, to understand that these elements are not accidents, that they actually are built into the story. They're built in for defensive reasons, not out of hostility toward the Jews, as much as attempt to protect themselves.
Judas's evil image accompanied the growth of anti-Semitism through medieval times to our own.
Judas historically has been used for horrendous acts of anti-Semitism, and this influenced events of modern times.
For more than 1,000 years in Europe, passion plays dramatizing the betrayal and crucifixion of Jesus were a fixture of Holy Week leading up to Easter. Into the 20th century, their portraits of Judas and Jews incited violence and helped inspire the greatest act of anti-Semitism in history.
The most famous Passion play took place in Germany. It was the Passion of Oberammergau, where you have a staging of the Passion, in many ways very anti-Semitic. And we know that, in fact, Adolf Hitler himself actually observed this play, and this, in fact, added fuel to the fire.
The portrait of Judas in the New Testament did not directly, but may have indirectly fed into the poisonous stream that brought about the Holocaust. It's not surprising that since the Holocaust, German theology especially has worked very hard to clean up the picture of Judas, including the group of Jesuits in Germany who have been leading the attack to make Judas a saint.
The idea of sainthood for Judas may strike many as outrageous, but an almost saintly portrait emerges in the Gospel of Judas, a portrait that was lost for 1,700 years, but now, finally, can be unveiled.
On a le bout de la lettre ici, c'est l'autre.
Oui, ça c'est ça appartient à ce epsilon. Ces points-là.
Back in Switzerland, the Judas puzzle is almost complete. The team concludes that about 15% of the gospel is lost forever, from holes in the text and fragments turned to dust. But 85% has been restored. And now, for the first time in almost 2,000 years, the Gospel of Judas can be read.
Munnalalak avunan, il chayim umada, udatalan bayat barak ushawa, lak shuvach lala.
A selection of scenes reveals a gospel that's both familiar and strange. These are passages from the gospel.
This is the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke with Judas 3 days before he celebrated Passover. When Jesus appeared on earth, he performed miracles and great wonders for the salvation of humanity. And since some walked in the way of righteousness, while others walked in their transgressions, 12 disciples were called. Often, he did not appear to his disciples as himself, but he was found as a child among them.
The fact that Jesus could appear as a child upon occasion in the Gospel of Judas is, in fact, paralleled in other Gospels too. That there is something childlike about Jesus. Sometimes he appeared to be like a child. Sometimes he was the child of God in that kind of literal sense of being childlike.
It's often the case in these texts, when it says that Jesus appeared to them as a child, that it's not meant to be taken literally. In the beginning of the teaching, he taught them only what they were able to see, and they could only understand the beginning level of his teaching. There's other texts that speak of Jesus appearing in the way that people could recognize him. To some he appeared as a child, to others as a mature man, because they weren't able to understand him on a deeper level.
The Gospel of Judas uses familiar scenes to convey unfamiliar ideas.
One day, he was with his disciples in Judea, and he found them gathered together and seated in pious observance. When he approached his disciples, offering a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread, he laughed.
Jesus comes upon the group of disciples when they are celebrating together what looks to be a sacred meal. Maybe it's kind of like the Eucharist. And they're offering a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread, and Jesus laughs. In fact, in the Gospel of Judas, Jesus laughs a great deal.
He's laughing because they think that they're worshiping the true God, but in fact they have it wrong. They're worshiping the God who created this world, who's not the true God. The only one who understands is Judas.
To the Gnostics, the God who created earth wasn't worthy of worship. Only the true God, a being beyond comprehension, was sacred. Jesus laughs at what he sees as false piety. But the apostles don't understand and grow angry with him.
المهمنتم خد منكم يكون يودع لي الناشر أخ دا كوشتا بقو
ليس لنا عزيز رباح
ليس لنا
عزيز رباح ليس لنا عزيز رباح.
Their spirits did not dare to stand before him, except for Judas Iscariot.
يدانا مانو أتأمان أتأتيتا ولا شوينا بالمان شمة دي خادة دي شلخة.
هلايخ من أخرانين يؤتا أخ رزاي مالكوثا مالكو ربا أفلا صوف دا أين ملخ دخماث ويتاي خاش فاث لافلا إذ بوناناث ولا إذ كراث باشا.
Jesus issues a challenge to the disciples. He says, let the perfect person inside of you step forward and face me. And that perfect person within is the inner person, the spiritual person that truly knows, the person that ought to have a knowledge of God and a knowledge of oneself. And the disciples say, well, we can do that, but they couldn't do it. And so Judas steps forward, and he was able to stand before Jesus.
But he doesn't just stand up. He's also modest. He doesn't stare Jesus in the face, but sensitive to the cultural norms of this time, he averts his glance. So he's got what it takes. He has, you might say, the spiritual backbone to stand up, but he has the good grace and modesty to know his place when he stands before Jesus.
Jesus, if he were like other Jewish teachers, would have probably taught one way to the crowds and other things to his disciples in secret. The Gospel of Mark in the New Testament says exactly that. If so, he taught the way teachers in antiquity ordinarily taught, and many still do today.
رباي بمخماي خماتي أوثران عسيتي المديها هون رقمي داي ورات فاني
التيوي شليخة دي ماكللا بيد كل خراني ماكسيلاك دي تيذي باي مالكوث الله أكاثلك يا زيرس.
أنا بالمحس طب ليه؟
ناهيروس كوكاخ فاك طاهر يسير من كل خراني التيوي رف من كلهم يهودا التيت باخ هدين بقرا دا أناش دا مكا سيلي يهودا كوكاف دا ميدبار هو كوكافاك.
Judas has had a vision, which I think confirms his choice. But he doesn't understand the vision until Jesus explains it to him. Judas understands now his mission, and he has the strength, the stamina to carry it out, which is to betray Jesus. But it's not a bad thing that he does. It's actually an act of sacrifice. It's like an act of worship. It's a good thing. It's a pious thing.
Jesus reveals these truths to Judas and Judas alone. Among these truths are that people in this world have a divine spark trapped within them that needs to be set free. Jesus himself represents a divine spark that needs to be set free.
Unlike the New Testament Gospels, the Gospel of Judas contains no crucifixion scene. It ends abruptly with Judas's betrayal. By omitting the crucifixion, Judas's Gospel added to tensions between the emerging Orthodox Church and the Gnostics.
Wie Jesus jan hierheen kontes himas ipusin.
In the early Gospels, it's the death and resurrection of Jesus that really matters for salvation. His body dies, and then God raises his body from the dead. This resurrection of the body is very important, so that Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John actually appears to his followers to show that he's still living, his body is still alive. That stands completely at odds with what happens in the Gospel of Judas, where there's no account of his death, because his death isn't what really matters, and there's especially no account of his resurrection. What matters is that the body is going to die, and the spirit is going to live on.
For the Gnostics, Jesus had to die to free himself of the prison of his body. But in the eyes of the Orthodox Church, that interpretation sealed their fate as heretics.
Mă scuzați, m-ați putea ajuta, vă rog?
Și un telefon ceva avem?
Noroc, Nicioe! Te invită să-ți alegi o mașină din 4. Compune imaginea din piesele de puzzle pe care le găsești în pungile Cio Chips. Când găsești piesa cheie, mașina e a ta.
Se potrivește perfect cu culorii intense a părului tău. Și a ta e frumoasă, Kitty. Da, dar părul e aspru și degradat. Nu le poți avea pe toate. Sigur că poți. Cu Garnier Color Naturals. Uite, intensă, nu? Wow, și ce mătăsos e! Datorită uleiului de măsline. Garnier Color Naturals. Culori intensă, fără păr degradat. Garnier!
We bought you a beer.
And Bill's on his way down to open the front gate.
We got the shower working.
And dinner's about to be served. Your taxi's waiting.
So where the bloody hell are you?
În fiecare zi, de 30 de ani, la Salonta facem mezeluri. Zi de zi alegem carnea, afumăm mezelurile cu fum din lemn fără rășini, le supraveghem 75 de zile viteza de uscare și temperatura, le însemânțăm cu mucegai nobil și apoi le curățăm. Zi de zi. Salonta. 30 de ani de experiență în mezeluri.
I gave a letter to the postman. He put it in this sack. Bright and early next morning, he brought my letter back. Return to sender, address unknown.
Jacob Scrânung, puterea Avintaromei.
Exploration.
Explorations, powered by Duracell.
Reacționăm la frig în diverse moduri. Pentru unii, orice grad sub zero e un coșmar, dar pe alții, un ger bun i-a ținut în viață.
N-aș fi crezut niciodată că voi supraviețui.
Știința folosește hipotermia în folosul vieții.
Explorations, powered by Duracell. Vineri seara la 7.
Un marfar scăpat de sub control atacă un oraș întreg. Seria anchete reconstituie povestea adevărată a unui tren fără control. În curând pe National Geographic Channel.
A gospel emerged from the sands of Egypt to challenge the New Testament account of Judas as a villain. Its journey from discovery to sale to theft finally reached a laboratory where its age was confirmed. We now know it's an authentic ancient text, but what does it mean to us today? Most experts don't believe any Gnostic gospel has the authority of the New Testament. So should the Gospel of Judas just be dismissed?
I don't need anything more than I get out of Matthew, Mark, St. Luke, and John. I mean, wow! Who needs anything more? What else could be added that's better? Can't imagine it. Well, the Gospel of Judas makes an important contribution to our knowledge of 2nd century Gnosticism. And I'm glad that it's been made available and that it was not lost. But the Gospel of Judas, I don't think, tells us anything about the historical Judas or the historical Jesus or about the factors that were at work in the early 1st century that led to Jesus' death. I don't think Judas contains authentic historical Jesus and Judas tradition.
How does he know? People who discredit these other Gospels insist that they all come from the 2nd century or later. Now, indisputably, the texts that we have come from the 3rd and 4th century. What we don't know is the dates of the original. It's impossible to know that.
Almost all experts believe the 4 Gospels of the New Testament were written between 60 and 100 AD. Because of Irenaeus, we know that the Gospel of Judas existed in 180 AD, but we have no way to know when the original was written. Deciding how the Gospel of Judas stacks up against the New Testament Gospels may depend not on when it was written, but on what you believe.
It's a question of faith, ultimately. It's not a historical or a literary judgment. It's a religious judgment that these texts have authority. So collectively, these books, these are our sacred books, and they have a kind of authority that we feel is God-given. And that's a discernment of the community as a whole.
For many believers, the Gospel of Judas is still heretical, just a footnote in history. But for others, it has a message that can be appreciated alongside the New Testament Gospels.
So it's not that these are necessarily opposites. It's not that you have to choose Mark or the Gospel of Thomas or Judas. The Gospels from Nag Hammadi and the Gospel of Judas are puzzling. And in fact, they're probably not meant to be publicly read. They were meant to be advanced level teaching. So they don't have the same function as the Gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Whether advanced course or heresy, the Gospel of Judas forces us to recognize that early on there wasn't just one Christianity. There were many.
Largely because of discoveries of ancient Gospels like the Gospel of Judas and like the Nag Hammadi library, scholars have learned about other forms of Christianity that didn't make it, that ended up being squelched and marginalized. They eventually disappeared.
The value of the Gospel of Judas comes first from the fact that it's a source for our understanding of Gnosticism. It's secondly a very important source for our understanding of what the early church did with the figure of Judas. That there were some, as there have been actually all throughout history, who could celebrate the existence of Judas.
Whether or not one agrees with it or finds it interesting or reprehensible, it's an enormously interesting perspective on it that some follower of Jesus in the early Christian movement obviously thought was significant.
The Gospel of Judas will always fuel debate. But it reveals certain inarguable truths as well. There are those who are dedicated to preserving the past, no matter the burden. And there are those who simply want to profit from it. The Gospel illuminates the diversity of early Christianity and reveals that people have always seen God in different ways. As it becomes part of our history, it challenges us to ask why we believe what we do.
Fixați-vă centurile de siguranță. Vom decola împreună într-o călătorie periculoasă. Sunt Andreea Marin, voi fi timp de o săptămână capitanul aeronavei National Geographic Channel.
Ar trebui să fie simplu. Te îmbarci, te relaxezi, moțăi un pic și aterizezi ușor.
Avionul nu trebuie să se dezintegreze, nu e bine să tragem cu rachete în el, iar capitanul nu își va pierde calmul nici dacă secundul vrea să-l omoare. Zborul n-ar trebui să fie atât de înfricoșător. National Geographic reconstituie încă o serie de accidente aeronautice. Dezastre în aer. Urmează pe National Geographic.
De unde vine senzația unică pe care ți-o dă Milka Lufle? E simplu. Sunt mii de bule de ciocolată.
Să-i dăm drumul! Hai, rata e servită! Nu avem destule bule! Ursule, treci la aparat!
E Milka Lufle, cu mii și mii de bule de ciocolată.
E atât de fină, oare cum se face?
Nu știu, dar cred că au o tehnologie foarte avansată.
Milka Lufle, cea mai fină ciocolată aerată.
Cauți o soluție cu efect imediat împotriva mătreții? Tigel Total de la Neutrogena este eficient împotriva mătreții chiar de la prima utilizare, prin combinarea de ingredienți antimătreață, ihtiol și elubiol, pentru eficiență de durată încă de la prima utilizare. Tigel Total de la Neutrogena.
Mătreața revine mereu? Acum spune adio! Garnier Fructis, primul șampon antimătreață cu efect antirecidivă cu concentrat activ de fructe. Acționează chiar de la prima aplicare. Eficacitatea lui durează 4 săptămâni de la oprirea tratamentului. Spune adio mătreții. Garnier Fructis antimătreață cu efect antirecidivă.
Garnier.
Nou de la Garnier. Fructis antimătreață special pentru păr gras.
Vă prezentăm Toyota Land Cruiser cu asistență electronică la urcare și, bineînțeles, asistență electronică la coborâre și la frânare de urgență. Și nu uitați că veți avea probabil nevoie și de asistență electronică la coborârea cu spatele. O legendă indestructibilă. Toyota Land Cruiser.
Vedeți câtă lume vorbește deja cu Eufonica? Sunt vizibil mulțumiți.
Alo!
Eufonica oferă o economie de până la 20% la convorbiri interjudețene și până la 40% la cele internaționale. Aveți abonament la telefon fix? Sunați gratuit la 0800 81688 și înregistrați-vă acum. Primiți contractul prin poștă, semnați-l și trimiteți-l înapoi. Cadoul nostru, 25 de minute interjudețene gratuite. Formați 1688 înainte de numărul apelat și vorbiți, vorbiți, vorbiți. E simplu, ieftin și ușor de utilizat. Eufonica. Telefonați mai ieftin.
Cel mai tânăr, dar viguros vinar de murfatlar rămâne 22 de lei noi până când vrem noi.
Consumul excesiv de alcool dăunează grav sănătății.
Evoluția, cea mai grozavă poveste istorisită vreodată. Sânge, furie, cooperare, conflicte. O singură lege a domnit întotdeauna, legea supraviețuirii. Este povestea ce ne poate schimba percepția asupra lumii noastre. Triumful vieții, sâmbătă seară la 7. Un asteroid gigant lovind Pământul. Sfârșitul rasei umane. Amenințarea unei mega-erupții. Ți-ai spus că e doar imaginație de Hollywood. Mai gândește-te. Cercetătorii studiază planeta, misterele ce o înconjoară și amenințările ce o pândesc. Nu e ficțiune, sunt dovezi. Planeta la control. În curând pe National Geographic.
Atmosfera se încinge în mai pe National Geographic Channel.
Da Vinci ne-a lăsat semne?